What if everything you know about Marco Polo is a lie? What if the most famous explorer in history never actually set foot in China? For over 700 years, historians have been debating whether Marco Polo was history's greatest storyteller or its most convincing fraud. The year was 1298, and Venice trembled under the weight of its own ambitions. The Mediterranean's greatest trading empire had reached the zenith of its power, yet its merchants harbored secrets that could shake the foundations of medieval knowledge. Among these secrets was a truth so scandalous that it would challenge everything the world believed about exploration, adventure, and the very nature of discovery itself. Marco Polo stood at the center of this conspiracy, though whether as its mastermind or its unwitting puppet remains one of history's most contentious mysteries. The man who claimed to have served Kublai Khan, who described the wonders of Cathay with such vivid detail that Europeans would spend centuries seeking his golden cities, may never have traveled beyond the familiar shores of the Black Sea. This revelation strikes at the heart of medieval Europe's understanding of the world. Marco Polo's account, known as Il Milione, or the Travels of Marco Polo, became the foundation upon which European cartographers built their maps, merchants planned their expeditions, and dreamers crafted their fantasies of the mysterious East. Christopher Columbus himself carried a copy of Marco Polo's book on his voyage to the New World, using it as a guide to the riches he expected to find in Cathay. But what if Columbus was following the directions of a fraud? What if the most influential travel narrative in human history was nothing more than an elaborate fiction, crafted by a clever Venetian merchant who understood that sometimes the most profitable journey is the one you never take? The evidence against Marco Polo's authenticity has been mounting for decades, yet it remains largely unknown to the general public. Historians still debate whether the discrepancies in his account represent the forgetfulness of an aging traveler, the embellishments of a natural storyteller, or the calculated deceptions of a con artist who understood that verification was impossible in an age before mass communication. Consider the staggering omissions in Marco Polo's supposedly comprehensive account of his 24 years in China. He never mentioned the Great Wall, despite claiming to have traveled extensively throughout the empire. He wrote nothing about Chinese tea ceremonies, though tea was central to Chinese culture and commerce. He failed to describe the practice of foot binding, a custom so prevalent that no genuine observer could have missed it. These weren't minor oversights, they were gaping holes in what should have been the most detailed account of Chinese civilization ever produced by a European. Yet Marco Polo's defenders argue that these omissions prove nothing. Medieval travelers, they claim, often focused on commercial opportunities rather than cultural curiosities. Perhaps Marco Polo simply wasn't interested in walls, tea ceremonies, or social customs. Perhaps his priorities lay elsewhere, in the spices and silks that could make a Venetian merchant wealthy beyond imagination. The truth, as it often does, lies buried beneath layers of political intrigue, commercial secrecy, and the peculiar circumstances of Marco Polo's imprisonment. In 1298, while serving as a commander in the Venetian navy, Marco Polo was captured during a naval battle against Genoa, Venice's greatest rival. It was in a Genoese prison that he met Rustichello of Pisa, a Romance writer who would become his collaborator in creating the most famous travel narrative in history. But was it collaboration or manipulation? Rustichello was a professional storyteller, skilled in the art of crafting tales that would captivate medieval audiences hungry for exotic adventures. He knew how to blend fact with fiction, how to season reality with just enough fantasy to make it irresistible. When Marco Polo began telling his stories of the East, Rustichello recognized the raw material for a masterpiece. Take a moment to like this video and subscribe, but only if you're genuinely enjoying what we're exploring here. Tell us in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is in your part of the world. The Venice of Marco Polo's youth was not merely a city, but a commercial empire that had transformed the Mediterranean into its private lake. By the time young Marco supposedly departed for his legendary journey in 1271, Venetian merchants had already established the most sophisticated intelligence network in the medieval world. Their fondecos, trading posts scattered across the eastern Mediterranean, served as nerve centers where information flowed as freely as silk and spices. This network held the key to understanding how a Venetian merchant could craft such a convincing account of distant lands without ever setting foot in them. The Polo family were not mere traders. They were information brokers operating at the highest levels of international commerce. Nicolò and Maffeo Polo, Marco's father and uncle, had indeed travelled eastward, but historians increasingly believe their journey ended not in Beijing, but in the bustling markets of Tabriz or Constantinople. The family's wealth came not from serving as ambassadors to Kublai Khan, as Marco's account claimed, but from their mastery of the complex web of intermediary trade that connected Europe to Asia. Venetian merchants rarely travelled the entire length of the Silk Road themselves. Instead, they operated through a sophisticated system of partnerships with Armenian, Persian, and Arab traders who carried goods and, more importantly, information across the vast distances between East and West. Marco Polo's supposed expertise in Eastern languages becomes suspect when examined through this lens. He claimed fluency in Persian, Mongolian, and Chinese, yet modern linguistic analysis of his text reveals no evidence of direct knowledge of Chinese language or customs. The Persian and Mongolian terms he used were already common in Mediterranean trading circles, picked up from the many Eastern merchants who frequented Venetian markets. The timeline of Marco's alleged journey also raises troubling questions. According to his account, the Polo family spent 17 years in China before beginning their return journey in 1292. Yet Venetian commercial records from this period show suspicious gaps in the family's documented activities, gaps that could easily be explained if Marco had remained in Venice, quietly gathering information from the constant stream of travelers passing through the city's markets. Consider the political context of late 13th century Venice. The city-state was locked in a bitter commercial rivalry with Genoa, and both powers understood that information was as valuable as gold. A detailed account of Eastern trade routes and commercial opportunities would have been worth a fortune to Venetian merchants planning their investments. Marco Polo's book provided exactly this information, conveniently organized in the form of an adventure narrative that could be shared without revealing its true commercial value. The sophistication of Venice's information gathering can be seen in the accuracy of Marco's descriptions of places he may never have visited. His account of Persian cities, for instance, demonstrates remarkable familiarity with local geography, customs, and economic conditions. But this accuracy becomes less mysterious when we realize that Persian merchants were permanent residents of Venice's foreign quarter, and that detailed intelligence about Persian trade routes was essential to Venetian commercial success. Historians continue to debate whether Marco Polo's family participated knowingly in this deception, or whether they were themselves victims of misinformation. The elder Polos may have genuinely believed they had reached China when they had actually terminated their journey in Persia or Armenia. Medieval geography was notoriously imprecise, and the boundaries between different Eastern kingdoms were poorly understood by European travelers. The evidence suggests that the Polo family's expertise lay not in traversal of vast distances, but in the complex art of long-distance trade finance. They understood letters of credit, currency exchange, and the intricate partnerships that made intercontinental commerce possible. This knowledge, combined with information gleaned from Eastern merchants in Venice, could easily have provided the foundation for Marco's detailed descriptions of Asian markets and trade goods. What made the deception possible was the very nature of medieval travel and communication. Verification was impossible across such vast distances, and the few Europeans who had travelled to the east rarely returned to contradict alternative accounts. Marco Polo's story filled a void in European knowledge, providing answers to questions that had puzzled scholars and merchants for centuries. The stone walls of the Genoese prison, where Marco Polo found himself in 1298, had witnessed countless tales of war and defeat, but none would prove as enduring as the stories that emerged from Cell Block, where two very different men forged an unlikely partnership. Marco Polo, the captured Venetian naval commander, possessed a mind filled with exotic tales and commercial knowledge. Rustichello of Pisa, his cellmate, was a professional romance writer whose previous works had entertained the courts of Europe with tales of Arthurian knights and courtly love. The meeting between these two men would produce one of history's most influential books, but it would also create the perfect conditions for the greatest literary fraud of the medieval period. Rustichello was no mere scribe. He was a master craftsman of narrative fiction who understood precisely how to blend reality with fantasy to create compelling stories. His previous works, including an Arthurian romance about Tristan, demonstrated his ability to take existing legends and reshape them into captivating tales that audiences would accept as truth. When Marco began recounting his experiences in the East, Rustichello immediately recognized the commercial potential of these stories. Medieval audiences had an insatiable appetite for tales of exotic lands, fantastic creatures, and impossible riches. The more extraordinary the claim, the more eagerly it was received. Rustichello possessed the literary skills to transform Marco's second-hand knowledge of Eastern trade routes into a coherent narrative that would satisfy this hunger for the marvelous. The collaborative process between the two men reveals itself in the text's structure and style. Il Milione reads less like a personal memoir and more like a carefully constructed romance, complete with the formulaic elements that Rustichello had perfected in his earlier works. The book's organization follows the pattern of medieval romances, with each chapter presenting a new wonder or challenge overcome by the heroic traveler. Historians have noted that many of the most fantastical elements in Marco Polo's account, the descriptions of dog-headed men, the accounts of provinces where diamonds grew like flowers, the tales of salamanders made from fireproof cloth, were already circulating in European literature before Marco's supposed journey. Rustichello, as a professional writer, would have been familiar with these existing traditions and could easily have incorporated them into Marco's narrative to make it more appealing to contemporary readers. The prison setting also provided the perfect excuse for any inconsistencies or gaps in Marco's memory. A man recounting 24 years of travels while imprisoned could reasonably be expected to forget details, conflate different experiences, or embellish certain episodes for dramatic effect. Any skeptical reader could attribute problems in the narrative to the difficult circumstances under which it was composed. The speed with which the book was completed raises additional suspicions. Complex travel narratives typically required years of careful composition, yet Marco and Rustichello produced their masterwork in a matter of months. This rapid completion suggests that much of the material may have been prepared in advance, or that the authors were drawing on existing sources rather than reconstructing memories of actual experiences. The original manuscript of Il Milione has never been found, making it impossible to determine how much of the text represents Marco's actual words versus Rustichello's literary embellishments. Later copies of the work show significant variations, suggesting that the text was modified and expanded by successive copyists who felt free to add their own improvements to the narrative. Rustichello's influence extends beyond mere literary style to the very conception of what Marco Polo's journey should accomplish. Medieval romance literature typically featured heroes who underwent transformative journeys that changed both themselves and their understanding of the world. Marco Polo's account follows this pattern precisely, presenting him as a naive young Venetian, who gradually develops into a sophisticated observer of Eastern civilization. The prison collaboration also explains why certain aspects of Marco's account seem designed more to entertain than to inform. Extended descriptions of hunting expeditions, elaborate court ceremonies, and exotic customs serve primarily dramatic functions rather than providing practical information for future travelers. These passages bear the unmistakable stamp of Rustichello's professional expertise in crafting compelling narrative episodes. The most damning evidence against Marco Polo's authenticity lies not in what he described, but in what he conspicuously failed to mention. For a man who claimed to have spent 17 years in the service of Kublai Khan and travelled extensively throughout the Chinese Empire, his omissions are so glaring that they suggest either willful deception or complete fabrication of his Eastern experiences. The Great Wall of China presents the most obvious puzzle. This massive fortification, stretching thousands of miles across northern China, was already ancient by Marco Polo's time and would have been impossible for any traveller to miss. Yet Marco's account contains not a single reference to what would later be called one of the wonders of the world. Defenders argue that the wall was in disrepair during the Yuan dynasty, but archaeological evidence shows that substantial portions remained visible and impressive throughout the 13th century. Even more telling is Marco's complete silence about tea, the beverage that defined Chinese social and commercial life. Tea ceremonies were central to Chinese culture. Tea houses dotted every major city, and tea constituted one of China's most important trade commodities. Any genuine observer of Chinese society would have encountered tea countless times daily, yet Marco never mentions it in his supposedly comprehensive account of Chinese customs and commerce. The practice of foot binding represents another inexplicable omission. This custom, prevalent among Chinese women of all social classes, was so widespread that it shaped the very architecture of Chinese homes and the design of women's shoes. Marco claimed to have observed Chinese court life intimately and to have traveled throughout Chinese cities, yet he never references this distinctive and unmistakable aspect of Chinese society. Perhaps most significantly, Marco failed to mention Chinese characters or the Chinese writing system. For a man who supposedly served as an administrator in the Chinese government and conducted extensive business throughout the empire, his complete ignorance of Chinese literacy is inexplicable. He never describes the beauty of Chinese calligraphy, the complexity of Chinese characters, or the prevalence of written communications in Chinese administration. Marco's account also lacks any reference to chopsticks, the distinctive eating implements used throughout Chinese society. Instead, his descriptions of dining customs could apply to any number of Middle Eastern cultures, suggesting that his knowledge of Eastern eating habits derived from Persian or Arab sources rather than direct Chinese experience. The absence of gunpowder from Marco's account presents another serious problem. Chinese military forces were already using gunpowder weapons extensively during the Yuan dynasty, and any observer of Chinese warfare would have encountered these revolutionary technologies. Marco describes various military campaigns and siege techniques, but never mentions the explosive devices that were transforming Chinese military strategy. Historians continue to debate whether these omissions represent selective memory, cultural bias, or deliberate falsification. Some argue that Marco Polo, as a Venetian merchant, focused primarily on commercial opportunities and may have considered domestic customs irrelevant to his trading interests. This explanation, however, fails to account for the commercial importance of tea or the military significance of gunpowder. The pattern of Marco's omissions becomes more suspicious when contrasted with his detailed knowledge of Persian and Arab customs. His descriptions of Persian cities, Islamic religious practices, and Middle Eastern trading procedures demonstrate the kind of intimate familiarity that comes from extended personal experience. The contrast suggests that Marco had indeed travelled extensively in the Middle East, but had never proceeded beyond the familiar world of Islamic civilization. Modern forensic analysis of Marco's text reveals additional problems with his supposed Chinese experiences. His descriptions of Chinese geography often conflict with actual topography, and his accounts of distances between Chinese cities contain numerous errors. These mistakes would be understandable if Marco were working from second-hand information, but they are difficult to explain if he had actually traveled the routes he describes. The linguistic evidence proves equally damaging. Marco's text contains numerous Persian and Arabic terms, but virtually no authentic Chinese vocabulary. The few Chinese words that appear in later versions of his account were likely added by copyists, who had access to more recent information about China. The original text shows no evidence of direct contact with Chinese language or culture. The geographic evidence suggests that Marco Polo's actual travels terminated somewhere in the Persian Gulf region, possibly in the great trading city of Tabriz or the port of Hormuz. These locations would have provided him with access to the vast network of Asian merchants who carried goods and information from China to the Mediterranean world. From such strategic positions, a clever observer could have assembled enough second-hand knowledge to construct a convincing account of more distant lands. Tabriz, in particular, represented the crossroads of medieval international commerce. Located in what is now northwestern Iran, this cosmopolitan city housed merchants from every corner of the known world. Chinese silk arrived there via Central Asian trade routes, Indian spices passed through its markets, and European traders established permanent settlements within its walls. A Venetian merchant stationed in Tabriz would have encountered representatives of every major trading culture and could have gathered detailed information about distant lands without ever leaving the city's bazaars. The Persian connection explains many peculiarities in Marco Polo's account. His descriptions of Chinese court ceremonies, for instance, bear striking similarities to Persian royal customs that were well documented in contemporary sources. The elaborate protocols he attributes to Kublai Khan's court mirror the practices of Persian shahs, suggesting that Marco may have witnessed Persian court life and projected these experiences onto his fictional Chinese journey. Marco's knowledge of Mongolian customs also becomes more plausible when viewed through the Persian lens. The Ilkhanate, the Mongol kingdom that controlled Persia during the late 13th century, maintained close connections with the Yuan dynasty in China. Persian-based merchants would have had regular contact with Mongol administrators and could have provided detailed information about Mongol court life, military organization, and administrative practices. The accuracy of Marco's descriptions of the Persian Gulf region itself provides strong evidence for this theory. His account of Hormuz, the great port at the entrance to the Persian Gulf, demonstrates intimate familiarity with local geography, climate, and commercial practices. He describes the city's defensive walls, the seasonal patterns of its trade winds, and the specific types of vessels used by Persian merchants with the precision that comes only from personal observation. Historians have documented the presence of Venetian merchants in Tabriz during the period when Marco Polo supposedly traveled to China. Commercial records show that several Venetian trading houses maintained permanent representatives in Persian cities, and that these agents regularly transmitted detailed information about Eastern markets back to Venice. Marco Polo's family may have been among these Persian-based traders, conducting profitable business while remaining thousands of miles short of their claimed destination. The Persian theory also explains Marco's detailed knowledge of the spice trade. His accurate descriptions of pepper cultivation, cinnamon harvesting, and nutmeg processing could have been obtained from Arab and Indian merchants who controlled these trades and frequently passed through Persian ports. The technical accuracy of these descriptions, combined with their obvious commercial value, suggest that Marco had indeed gained expert knowledge of Eastern commodities through direct contact with their producers and distributors. Archaeological evidence from Persian sites supports this interpretation. Excavations at medieval Tabriz have revealed extensive Venetian trade goods, including distinctive Murano glass and specialized textile techniques that were unique to Venetian production. These findings confirm the substantial Venetian presence in Persia during Marco Polo's era and demonstrate the sophistication of the commercial networks that connected Italian merchants with Asian suppliers. The linguistic evidence also points toward Persia as Marco's eastern terminus. His text contains numerous Persian words and phrases used with appropriate context and precise meaning. This linguistic facility suggests extended residence in Persian-speaking regions rather than the brief transit that his official account describes. Native Persian speakers who have analyzed Marco's text note that his use of Persian commercial terminology demonstrates the kind of fluency that develops only through sustained business relationships. Climate descriptions in Marco's account provide additional support for the Persian theory. His references to seasonal weather patterns, agricultural cycles, and natural phenomena accurately reflect Persian Gulf conditions, but contain subtle errors when describing more distant regions. These discrepancies suggest first-hand familiarity with Persian climate combined with second-hand knowledge of Chinese weather conditions. The court of Kublai Khan, as described in Marco Polo's account, presents one of the most elaborate and detailed portraits of medieval royal life ever written. Yet, this very elaborateness may provide the strongest evidence against Marco's presence there. His descriptions of palace architecture, court ceremonies, and imperial administration contain a suspicious blend of accurate historical details mixed with elements that historians now recognize as literary conventions borrowed from earlier travel narratives. Marco's portrait of Kublai Khan himself reads more like a composite character assembled from multiple sources than the product of personal acquaintance. His physical description of the Great Khan matches details found in Persian and Arab chronicles that were circulating in Mediterranean trading centers decades before Marco's supposed journey. The personality traits he attributes to Kublai Khan, wisdom, generosity, curiosity about foreign customs, follow the standard template for idealized Eastern rulers that appeared regularly in medieval European literature. The administrative details that Marco provides about the Yuan court system reveal a similarly problematic pattern. While some of his information about Chinese governmental structure proves accurate when checked against Chinese historical records, other details appear to be borrowed from descriptions of Persian or Arab administrative systems. This mixing of accurate and inaccurate information suggests an author who had access to some genuine intelligence about Chinese government, but lacked the first-hand experience necessary to distinguish reliable from unreliable sources. Marco's claim to have served as a government official under Kublai Khan faces particular scrutiny from modern historians. Chinese administrative records from the Yuan dynasty, which survive in remarkable detail, contain no mention of any European administrator matching Marco's description. Given the meticulous record-keeping practices of Chinese bureaucracy, the complete absence of any documentary evidence for Marco's official service raises serious questions about this central element of his narrative. The hunting expeditions that Marco describes in elaborate detail follow patterns found in earlier Persian and Arab travel literature, rather than reflecting documented Chinese imperial hunting practices. His accounts of elaborate winter hunts, exotic game animals, and ceremonial presentations of captured prey mirror descriptions found in the Book of Kings and other Persian literary classics that were well known in European trading circles. Historians have identified specific passages in Marco's court descriptions that appear to be adapted from the accounts of earlier travelers to Mongol courts in Persia and Central Asia. The physical layout of the palace that Marco describes, for instance, closely resembles contemporary descriptions of the Mongol court at Karakorum rather than the Yuan palaces at Beijing. This suggests that Marco may have adapted existing accounts of Mongol court life to create his descriptions of Kublai Khan's court. The seasonal progression of court activities that Marco describes also raises suspicions. His account of how the imperial court moved between different palaces throughout the year follows patterns that were standard in Persian royal households, but differed significantly from documented Chinese imperial practices. Chinese emperors of the Yuan dynasty maintained more sedentary courts than their Mongol predecessors, yet Marco's descriptions suggest a nomadic lifestyle that had largely disappeared from Chinese imperial practice by his supposed period of service. Marco's descriptions of court entertainment present another area where second-hand knowledge becomes apparent. His accounts of theatrical performances, musical presentations, and ceremonial dances contain generic details that could apply to any number of Asian court traditions. He provides no specific information about distinctively Chinese performance styles, musical instruments, or theatrical conventions that would have been immediately apparent to any genuine observer of Yuan court life. The diplomatic procedures that Marco describes also follow Persian rather than Chinese patterns. His accounts of how foreign ambassadors were received, how tribute was presented, and how imperial audiences were conducted match Persian court protocols documented in contemporary sources. Chinese diplomatic customs, which differed significantly from Persian practices, receive no accurate representation in Marco's supposedly first-hand account. Perhaps most tellingly, Marco's descriptions of religious practices at Kublai Khan's court demonstrate fundamental misunderstandings about Chinese Buddhism and Confucianism. While he accurately describes some aspects of Islamic practice that he would have encountered in Persian Mongol courts, his references to Chinese religious traditions contain basic errors that no genuine observer could have made. The commercial intelligence networks that connected Venice to the distant markets of Asia operated through a sophisticated system of partnerships, intermediaries, and information brokers that made direct travel unnecessary for gathering detailed knowledge about Eastern trade conditions. These networks, established over generations of Venetian commercial expansion, provided Marco Polo with access to the kind of detailed information about Asian markets that could easily be mistaken for first-hand experience. Armenian merchants played a particularly crucial role in these intelligence networks. Their communities stretched from Constantinople to Beijing, and their commercial relationships often spanned multiple generations. Armenian traders maintained detailed records of market conditions, price fluctuations, and political developments throughout their trading territories. A Venetian merchant with strong Armenian connections could obtain remarkably accurate information about Chinese silk production, Indian spice cultivation, or Central Asian horse breeding without ever leaving the Mediterranean region. The Venetian Fondaco system created permanent intelligence gathering stations throughout the eastern Mediterranean and Black Sea regions. These trading posts served not merely as commercial facilities, but as information clearinghouses where merchants from diverse backgrounds shared knowledge about distant markets. The Fondaco in Constantinople, for instance, regularly hosted traders who had traveled from India, Persia, and even China. Their conversations, overheard and recorded by Venetian agents, provided a constant stream of intelligence about conditions in distant lands. Jewish merchant networks offered another crucial source of information. Jewish trading communities maintained connections across vast distances, and their members often possessed detailed knowledge of local customs, political conditions, and commercial opportunities in regions where they had never personally traveled. The accuracy of Marco Polo's descriptions of various eastern cities' Jewish quarters suggests that he had access to this specialized intelligence network. The system of commercial correspondence that connected Venetian merchants with their distant partners generated detailed written reports about conditions throughout Asia. These letters, written in various languages and scripts, contained precisely the kind of information that appears in Marco Polo's account: details about local rulers, descriptions of notable buildings, assessments of military strength, and evaluations of commercial opportunities. A skilled linguist with access to this correspondence could have assembled a comprehensive picture of Asian conditions without leaving Venice. Venetian investment in translation services supported this intelligence-gathering effort. The city employed professional translators who specialized in Persian, Arabic, Armenian, and other Eastern languages. These scholars regularly translated commercial documents, diplomatic correspondence, and travel accounts for Venetian merchants and government officials. Marco Polo's family, as prominent traders, would have had access to these translation services and could have studied detailed accounts of Eastern travels written in languages they did not personally understand. The practice of commercial espionage was well established in medieval Mediterranean trade. Venetian merchants regularly employed agents to gather intelligence about their competitors' activities, market conditions in distant cities, and political developments that might affect trade routes. These agents operated throughout the Eastern Mediterranean and often penetrated deep into Asian markets. Their reports, compiled and analyzed in Venice, provided the kind of detailed information about Eastern conditions that Marco Polo demonstrates in his account. Partnership agreements between Venetian and Eastern merchants created additional channels for information flow. These contracts often required Eastern partners to provide regular reports about local conditions, market opportunities, and political developments. The cumulative effect of these reports would have given Venetian merchants detailed knowledge about regions they had never visited personally. The timing of information flow through these networks explains some puzzling aspects of Marco Polo's account. His descriptions of certain eastern cities reflect conditions that existed several years before his supposed arrival there, suggesting that his information came from reports written by earlier travelers rather than from his own observations. This temporal displacement would be natural if Marco were working from commercial intelligence gathered over many years rather than from recent personal experience. Venetian commercial records reveal the existence of a formal intelligence sharing system among major trading houses. Families like the Polos participated in this system, contributing information they had gathered while receiving access to intelligence collected by other merchants. This collaborative approach to information gathering meant that no single merchant needed to travel to every important market personally in order to maintain current knowledge about global trading conditions. The medieval tradition of travel literature created an environment where readers expected and even demanded a certain level of exaggeration and fantastical elements in accounts of distant lands. This literary context helps explain how Marco Polo's narrative could gain acceptance despite its questionable authenticity, and provides insight into the collaborative process between Marco and his co-author Rustichello. Medieval audiences distinguished between different categories of truth, and travel literature occupied a unique position in this hierarchy. Readers understood that accounts of distant journeys would necessarily contain elements of hearsay, speculation, and artistic embellishment. The complete accuracy that modern readers expect from travel writing was neither anticipated nor desired by medieval audiences, who valued entertainment and moral instruction as much as factual information. The Book of Wonders tradition, established by earlier works like the Travels of Sir John Mandeville, had already accustomed European readers to tales of dog-headed men, lands where precious stones grew like fruit, and kingdoms ruled by mythical Christian monarchs. Marco Polo's account, while more restrained than some contemporary works, still contained enough marvelous elements to satisfy readers' expectations for exotic adventure stories. Rustichello's professional background in Romance literature influenced the narrative structure of Marco's account in ways that modern readers often overlook. Medieval romances followed established patterns. Heroes encountered obstacles, overcame challenges through wit or courage, and returned home transformed by their experiences. Marco Polo's journey, as presented in El Milione, follows this template precisely, suggesting that Rustichello shaped the raw material of Marco's stories into a form that would appeal to contemporary literary tastes. The practice of authoritative lying was well established in medieval literature. Authors regularly claimed divine inspiration, ancient sources, or personal experience to lend credibility to fictional narratives. Readers participated in this convention, accepting obviously fictional elements as long as the overall narrative provided entertainment or moral instruction. Marco Polo's account operates within this tradition, using the claim of personal experience to authorize what may have been largely fictional content. Contemporary travel writers like William of Rubric and John of Plano Carpini had already established the credibility of European travel to Mongol courts, making Marco's claims more plausible to medieval readers. These earlier accounts provided a framework of established facts into which Marco could insert his own stories. By aligning his narrative with details from these authentic accounts, Marco could enhance the credibility of his more questionable claims. The commercial motivation behind travel literature publishing also influenced the content and style of these works. Publishers and authors understood that extraordinary claims sold more copies than mundane descriptions of ordinary places. The market for travel literature rewarded authors who could provide exotic entertainment rather than accurate geographical information. This economic pressure encouraged embellishment and may have motivated Marco and Rustichello to enhance their narrative with elements borrowed from other sources. Monastic scriptoriums played a crucial role in preserving and transmitting travel literature, but they also introduced their own modifications to these texts. Monks who copied travel accounts often added marginal notes, incorporated information from other sources, or modified passages they considered inappropriate or inaccurate. The surviving manuscripts of Marco Polo's account show evidence of this editorial intervention, making it difficult to determine which elements represent original content versus later additions. The absence of systematic fact-checking in medieval publishing meant that even obviously fictional elements could gain acceptance through repetition. Once Marco Polo's account began circulating, its details became incorporated into other geographical works, maps, and travel narratives. This process of cross-referencing created an illusion of independent confirmation that reinforced the credibility of questionable claims. Medieval readers' limited geographical knowledge made them unable to identify many of the errors and impossibilities in travel literature. Few Europeans had any reliable information about Asian geography, Chinese customs, or the logistics of transcontinental travel. This ignorance provided authors with considerable freedom to invent details without fear of contradiction. The oral tradition that preceded written travel accounts also contributed to the accumulation of fictional elements. Stories passed through multiple narrators inevitably acquired embellishments, conflations, and outright fabrications. Even if Marco Polo's original stories contained authentic elements, the process of oral transmission before written recording would have introduced numerous distortions. Modern defenders of Marco Polo's authenticity have mounted sophisticated arguments to counter the mounting evidence against his Chinese journey, yet their efforts often reveal more about contemporary academic politics than about medieval historical reality. These scholars, led by institutions with significant investments in Marco Polo studies, have developed increasingly elaborate explanations for the glaring omissions and inconsistencies in his account. The most common defense argues that Marco Polo's commercial background explains his selective attention to certain aspects of Chinese culture while ignoring others. Proponents of this theory suggest that a Venetian merchant would naturally focus on trade goods, transportation routes, and political conditions, while paying little attention to domestic customs like tea drinking or foot binding. This explanation, however, fails to address the commercial importance of tea or the administrative significance of Chinese writing systems. Archaeological discoveries have provided some support for Marco Polo's defenders. Excavations at sites mentioned in his account have occasionally revealed details that match his descriptions, particularly regarding urban layouts and architectural features. However, these confirmations often involve information that was available through secondary sources and do not necessarily prove Marco's personal presence at these locations. Linguistic analysis has become a battleground between supporters and critics of Marco Polo's authenticity. Defenders point to Persian and Mongolian terms in his text as evidence of direct contact with Eastern languages, while critics note the complete absence of authentic Chinese vocabulary. Recent computational analysis of the text has revealed patterns consistent with translation from Persian sources rather than original composition by someone familiar with Chinese culture. The discovery of Chinese documents mentioning Europeans in Yuan dynasty records has energized Marco Polo's defenders, though none of these references can be definitively linked to Marco himself. Some scholars argue that Chinese records were incomplete and that Marco's service might have been documented in archives that have since been lost. This argument from absence, however, conflicts with the generally excellent preservation of Yuan administrative records. DNA analysis of claimed Marco Polo artifacts has produced inconclusive results that both sides interpret as supporting their positions. Hair samples and textile fragments allegedly associated with Marco have yielded genetic markers consistent with Mediterranean populations, but critics argue that these artifacts lack clear provenance and may have originated from later European visitors to China. Geographic analysis using modern mapping techniques has revealed both accuracies and errors in Marco Polo's route descriptions. His account of certain Persian and Central Asian locations proves remarkably precise, while his descriptions of Chinese geography contain numerous mistakes. Defenders explain these discrepancies by arguing that Marco's memory deteriorated over time, or that he relied on local guides whose information was sometimes inaccurate. Computer modeling of medieval trade routes has shown that the journey described by Marco Polo would have been theoretically possible, though extremely difficult and dangerous. However, the same modeling demonstrates that alternative routes terminating in Persia or Central Asia would have provided access to most of the same commercial information that appears in Marco's account. Contemporary Chinese scholars have generally remained skeptical of Marco Polo's claims, noting that his descriptions of Chinese culture contain fundamental misunderstandings that no genuine long-term resident could have made. Western defenders often dismiss this skepticism as cultural bias, but Chinese historians' intimate familiarity with their own historical records provides them with unique insights into the accuracy of Marco's claims. New manuscript discoveries continue to complicate the debate. Recently uncovered versions of Marco Polo's text contain variations that suggest the narrative underwent significant modifications during its early transmission. Some passages appear in certain manuscripts but not others, indicating that different copyists felt free to add or subtract material based on information available to them. Statistical analysis of Marco Polo's text has revealed patterns that some scholars interpret as evidence of compilation from multiple sources rather than unified personal narrative. The linguistic complexity varies significantly between different sections, suggesting different authors or source materials. Defenders counter that this variation reflects the collaborative nature of Marco's work with Rustichello and the long time span covered by his supposed travels. The academic investment in Marco Polo's studies has created institutional pressure to defend his authenticity, regardless of evidence to the contrary. Universities offer degree programs in Marco Polo's studies. Scholarly careers depend on his historical significance, and tourism industries in multiple countries profit from his legendary status. This economic and academic infrastructure provides powerful incentives to maintain traditional interpretations despite mounting contrary evidence. The legacy of Marco Polo transcends questions of historical accuracy to reveal fundamental truths about human nature, the power of storytelling, and the complex relationship between imagination and reality in shaping our understanding of the world. Whether Marco Polo ever set foot in China matters less than the profound impact his narrative had on European consciousness and the subsequent course of global exploration. Christopher Columbus carried a heavily annotated copy of Marco Polo's book on his voyages to the New World, using it as a guide to the riches he expected to find in what he believed was the eastern coast of Asia. The irony is profound. Columbus may have been following the directions of a man who never made the journey, yet this fictional guidance led to one of history's most consequential discoveries. The Americas were found by a navigator chasing the shadows of a possibly imaginary journey. The influence of Marco Polo's account on European cartography demonstrates how fictional narratives can acquire the force of geographic fact through repetition and institutional acceptance. Medieval and Renaissance maps incorporated Marco's descriptions of Asian geography, creating visual representations of lands that the mapmakers had never seen based on accounts that may have been largely fabricated. These maps in turn influenced subsequent explorers and merchants, creating a feedback loop where fiction gradually transformed into accepted reality. The commercial impact of Marco Polo's narrative reveals the economic power of information, whether accurate or not. Venetian merchants used details from his account to plan trading expeditions. Portuguese navigators consulted his descriptions when establishing their Asian trade routes, and Dutch explorers relied on his geographic information when mapping the East Indies. The profitability of these ventures depended not on the accuracy of Marco's account, but on its ability to inspire confidence and provide a framework for understanding Asian markets. Modern tourism industries in China, Central Asia, and the Mediterranean have constructed elaborate Marco Polo heritage trails that attract millions of visitors annually. These routes, marketed as following in Marco Polo's footsteps, generate substantial economic benefits for regions that may never have hosted the historical Marco Polo. The commercial success of these tourism initiatives demonstrates how legendary narratives can create economic realities that transcend their historical foundations. The psychological appeal of Marco Polo's story reveals deep human needs for adventure, discovery, and transcendence of ordinary limitations. His narrative provides vicarious experience of exotic travels and contact with alien cultures, satisfying desires that most people cannot fulfill through direct experience. This psychological function explains why questions about Marco's authenticity often provoke emotional rather than rational responses from both scholars and popular audiences. Educational systems worldwide continue to present Marco Polo as a factual historical figure, despite the mounting evidence against his claimed Chinese journey. Textbooks, documentary films, and museum exhibitions reinforce his legendary status, creating new generations who accept his story as established fact. This institutional momentum demonstrates how educational systems can perpetuate historical myths long after scholarly consensus has shifted. The digital age has complicated rather than resolved questions about Marco Polo's authenticity. Internet resources provide access to both sophisticated scholarly analysis and popular misinformation, allowing individuals to select evidence that supports their preferred interpretation. Online travel blogs, educational websites, and social media discussions often present conflicting accounts of Marco Polo's historical status without providing readers with the tools necessary to evaluate competing claims. The comparison between Marco Polo and contemporary travel influencers reveals striking parallels in how charismatic individuals can shape public perception of distant places through compelling narratives. Modern travel bloggers and social media personalities wield similar power to influence public understanding of foreign cultures, often with similar mixtures of accurate observation and creative embellishment. If you enjoyed this exploration of Marco Polo's controversial legacy, take a moment to like the video and subscribe to our channel. Share your thoughts in the comments about where you're watching from and what time it is in your part of the world. We love connecting with our global audience. The ultimate lesson of Marco Polo's story may be that the distinction between truth and fiction becomes less important than the human capacity to transform stories into reality through collective belief and action. Whether Marco Polo was history's greatest explorer or its most successful fraud, his narrative achieved something arguably more significant than any individual journey. It expanded the boundaries of European imagination and set in motion the forces that would eventually connect all corners of the human world. In the end, we're left to calmly reflect on this enduring mystery as we look forward to exploring more hidden stories in our next adventure together.